The worn photograph was tucked into the back pocket of her dark denim jeans, cracked down the middle, and faded to the color of weak tea. It showed a man standing in front of a stone building with a hammer raised above an anvil. Wren Calloway had found it pinned to a bulletin board outside a gas station in Abingdon 2 days ago. Someone had written on the back in pencil, Damascus Forge, 1923. Nobody wants it. She had unpinned the photograph and slipped it into her pocket without thinking twice. Now, she was walking along the Virginia Creeper Trail into Damascus with the morning mist pooling in the valley below. The photograph pressed against her hip with every step. She was 19 years old, and she had $31 in her front pocket and no place in the world to sleep tonight. Her ash-brown hair hung in twin braids past her shoulders. Her chambray shirt was wrinkled from 3 nights of sleeping in it. Black tank top underneath was the only clean layer she had left. Her brown leather cowboy boots were scuffed white at the toes. A leather belt bag hung at her hip, holding everything she owned that mattered. Walking beside her, with a feathered tail curling upward and a steady gait, was a russet gold dog named Bramble. If you love stories about fresh starts and the animals who walk beside us through them, welcome to Paws and Trails Stories. Take a moment to subscribe so you never miss one of these journeys. Bramble was a Nova Scotia duck-tolling retriever mix, roughly 18 months old and 38 lb of compact energy held together by rust-colored fur and stubbornness. Her coat was a deep russet gold that darkened along her spine and light to copper at her belly and legs. She had a wide white blaze on her chest, shaped like a crooked diamond. Her tail was heavily feathered and curled slightly upward at the tip, even when she was resting. Her most distinctive feature was her ears, which never quite agreed with each other. The left ear folded forward in a permanent crease that gave her a quizzical look. The right ear stood mostly upright with just the tip tipping over, so she always looked like she was asking a question nobody had answered yet. She had bright amber eyes that tracked everything with sharp intelligence. Wren had found her 5 months earlier hiding under a collapsed porch in Rural Retreat, Virginia. The dog had been thin and covered in burrs, and would not come out for food alone. Wren had sat cross-legged in the dirt for 3 hours without moving until Bramble crawled out on her belly and pressed her nose into Wren's open palm. They had been inseparable since that afternoon in the red Virginia clay. In 5 months of walking together, Bramble had never once strayed more than 10 ft from Wren's side. Bramble had a habit of carrying sticks that were far too large for her body. She would drag an entire branch down the trail with her head tilted sideways, refusing to drop it until she found the perfect spot to set it down. Damascus sat in a narrow gap where Laurel Creek met Beaver Dam Creek in Washington County, Virginia. The town had a population of about 800 people. It was famous among hikers as the place where the Appalachian Trail and the Virginia Creeper Trail crossed right through the center of town. The main street ran alongside the creek and held a scattering of outfitter shops, a small library, and a white clapboard church. Beyond those stood a row of old commercial buildings dating to the 1880s and 1890s. Some of those buildings had been converted into hostels and gear shops for through hikers, while others stood empty with dark windows and padlocked doors. Damascus was a town that lived and breathed with the rhythm of hiking season. In summer, it hummed with foot traffic, and in winter it went quiet as a held breath. Wren arrived in the gap between seasons. The dogwoods were blooming along the creek banks, and the air smelled like damp earth and new leaves. She had no plan to stop here, and had been walking south from Marion for 4 days with no particular destination. But Damascus had other ideas for her. She saw the building from the footbridge over Laurel Creek. It sat on a half-acre lot behind the main street, at the end of a gravel path overgrown with chickweed and dandelions. The structure was built from rough-cut limestone blocks with dark timber framing. It had a steeply pitched roof of standing seam metal that had gone orange with rust. A wide stone chimney rose from the center of the building, easily 4 ft across at the base, and blackened with old soot. The double front doors were made of thick oak planks reinforced with iron straps. One of them hung open about 6 in, showing only darkness inside. The lot around the building was wild, with honeysuckle and blackberry brambles climbing the stone walls. An old hand-painted sign leaned against the foundation, but the paint had flaked away to bare wood, and whatever it once said was gone. Bramble stopped on the footbridge and locked her eyes on the building with her folded ear twitched forward and her feathered tail gone perfectly still. She let out a single quiet whine that Wren had learned to take seriously. That sound meant Bramble had found something worth investigating. Wren crossed the bridge and walked to the building, pressing her face against the gap in the doors without seeing anything in the dark interior. She pulled a worn photograph from her back pocket and held it up beside the building. The stone walls matched. The chimney matched. The iron-strapped doors matched. This was the Damascus Forge from the 1923 photograph. She stood there for several minutes with the photograph in one hand and her other hand resting on the rough limestone wall. The cold stone pressed against her palm even in the morning sun. Bramble sat at her feet and looked up at her with those mismatched ears tilted at different angles. Wren folded the photograph carefully and slipped it back into her pocket. "Well," she said quietly to Bramble, "let us find out who owns this place." She found the owner through the woman at the library. Her name was Nessa Compton, about 52 years old with silver-streaked auburn hair and reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose. Nessa told Wren that the blacksmith shop had been built in 1881 by a man named Hosea Garber. It had operated as a working forge until 1961, when the last blacksmith retired. The building was sold to a family who used it for storage, and that family had moved to Roanoke in 1998. It had been sitting empty ever since. The current owner was a woman named Zella Millsaps who lived in Bristol and had inherited the property from her uncle. Nessa leaned across the library counter and lowered her voice. She said that Zella had been trying to unload the building for 8 years and that nobody wanted it. Wren asked what the asking price was. Nessa shook her head slowly and said that last she heard, Zella would take $1 just to get it off her books. Wren looked down at Bramble, who was lying on the cool library floor with a stick wedged under her chin. $1, Wren repeated quietly. The taxes alone cost more than the building was worth to anyone. Nessa wrote down Zella's phone number on a slip of paper and slid it across the counter. Wren called from the pay phone outside the post office. Zella Millsaps answered on the 4th ring. Her voice was tired but polite. Wren told her she was interested in the blacksmith shop. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Zella asked if Wren knew what condition it was in. Wren said she had seen the outside. "Honey, the outside is the good part." Zella explained that the roof leaked in 2 places. There was no electricity and no plumbing, and the forge had not been lit in over 60 years. The county had cited her twice for the overgrown lot alone. She told Wren she would sell it for $1 and cover the deed transfer costs herself. But Wren would need to take full responsibility for the property and the back taxes, which came to $215. Wren said she would need a few days to get the money together. Zella laughed softly and said, "Take your time. That building has been waiting since 1998, and it can wait a few more days." Wren earned the money in 4 days of hard work. She swept the front porch of the outfitter's shop for $30. She washed dishes at the Trail Hostel for 2 days at $40 per day. She sold 3 hand-braided twine bracelets to hikers at the trailhead for $5 each. She helped a woman named Bess Kendrick carry boxes of donated books from a truck into the library basement for $25. On the morning of the 5th day, she walked to the post office and mailed a money order for $216 to Zella Millsaps in Bristol. The extra dollar was taped to a note that read, "For the building." The deed arrived by mail 9 days later. Wren Calloway, 19 years old, was now the legal owner of an 1881 blacksmith shop in Damascus, Virginia. She had $8 remaining to her name. Bramble stood beside her on the post office steps as she held the deed in both hands. Dog looked up at her and wagged her feathered tail once. "We have a home," Wren told her. And it was the first time she had said that word in over a year. The first time she pushed both oak doors fully open, daylight flooded the interior and revealed a space that stopped her in her tracks. The main room measured roughly 24 ft by 32 ft, with a ceiling that peaked at about 14 ft under heavy timber beams. The limestone walls were blackened with over a century of soot and smoke. The floor was packed earth hardened by decades of heat, hammer blows, and foot traffic. Directly in the center of the room stood the forge. It was a massive stone and brick structure, roughly 5 ft wide and 4 ft deep, with a raised hearth and a cast iron fire pot. A brick chimney hood funneled upward into the main chimney stack. The forge was filled with cold ash and debris that had settled over decades. To the right of the forge stood a Peter Wright anvil, roughly 200 lb of cast steel, mounted on a thick oak stump. Driven into the packed earth floor, the face of the anvil was pitted and scarred from decades of hammer strikes, but the horn was still true, and the hardy hole was clear. Along the walls hung iron tools on hand-forged hooks. There were tongs of 6 different sizes, 3 different hammers, a set of hardy tools, and a swage block. A slack tub sat against the far wall. Nothing more than a rusted iron barrel sunk halfway into the earth floor. Everything was coated in a thick layer of gray ash, and dust and cobwebs hung from the ceiling beams in dense curtains. Bramble walked into the center of the room, sneezed 3 times in rapid succession, and immediately began investigating the base of the forge with intense focus. Wren spent 2 full days cleaning just the main room, sweeping out years of accumulated debris, dead leaves, and animal nests. She found the remains of a bird nest inside the chimney hood. She discovered 2 rat tunnels along the base of the east wall and packed them tight with the steel wool and gravel. She wiped down every wall surface she could reach with a wet rag. The soot came off in thick black streaks that stained the cloth instantly. She went through 14 rags in the first day alone. On the 3rd day, she turned her attention to the forge itself. She began scooping out the cold ash from the fire pot with a rusted coal shovel. The ash was packed deep with nearly 2 ft of it compacted into the fire box over the decades. She worked slowly and carefully, filling bucket after bucket, while Bramble sat beside the forge watching every shovelful with her ears at full attention. On the 7th bucket, Wren heard a metallic scrape beneath the shovel. She set the tool aside and began clearing the remaining ash with her bare hands. Bramble was right beside her with her tail motionless and her ears locked forward, watching with the kind of focus she usually reserved for squirrels. What Wren found buried in the base of the forge changed everything about her situation. Beneath the last layer of packed ash, wedged into a cavity in the fire pot's brick lining, was an iron box roughly 14 in long, 8 in wide, and 6 in deep. It was forged from heavy plate iron with riveted seams and a simple hasp closure. The iron had gone dark black from years of heat exposure but was not rusted through. She pulled it free from the ash and set it on the anvil face, estimating its weight at 15 to 20 lb. She lifted the hasp and opened the lid. Inside, nested in a bed of charcoal dust that had acted as a desiccant for decades, were items that made her sit down on the packed earth floor and stare. There were 7 hand-forged knives, each one different in size and shape, but all sharing the same exceptional construction quality. The blades were pattern-welded steel, showing the distinctive layered swirl patterns that collectors called Damascus steel. The handles were wrapped in wire and leather that had dried but not crumbled. Beneath the knives, wrapped in a piece of oiled canvas, were 3 ornamental iron pieces. The first was a gate finial in the shape of an acorn with oak leaves, roughly 8 in tall. It was forged from a single piece of iron with extraordinary detail in the leaf veins. The second was a fireplace trivet with scrollwork legs and a twisted rope border. The third was a candle holder with a spiral stem and a flower-shaped cup, and all 3 pieces showed the blackened patina of forge-finished iron. Beneath the ornamental pieces, folded into a leather pouch, were 11 hand-forged tool heads, including 4 specialized hammer heads, 3 chisel heads, 2 punch heads, and 2 swaged eyes. Each one bore a small maker's mark stamped into the metal, a simple letter G inside a diamond shape. At the very bottom of the box, pressed flat against the iron base, was a folded piece of paper that was yellow and brittle but still legible. The handwriting was small and careful, and it read, "These are my best pieces. Whoever finds them, know that I made everyone by hand in this forge. Hosea Garber, Damascus, Virginia, 1919." Wren sat on the floor of the blacksmith shop for a long time with the iron box open on her lap. Bramble pressed her nose against Wren's elbow and held it there. The russet gold dog did not move, and just breathed warm air against Wren's skin, and waited. Wren touched each piece in the box one at a time. The pattern-welded blades caught the daylight from the open doors and threw back subtle bands of silver and dark gray. The acorn finial was so precisely forged that she could count individual veins on every leaf. The note from Hosea Garber was the most fragile thing in the box, and somehow it felt like the heaviest. She read it again, and then a 3rd time before pressing the folded paper gently against her chest and closing her eyes. If you are enjoying this story, take a second to hit that subscribe button. It helps this channel keep bringing you stories of hidden things found in unexpected places. She needed S. Omion, who understood the value of what she had found, and Nessa at the library connected her with a man named Webb Alderman. He was 64 years old and worked as a certified appraiser, specializing in antique tools, early American metalwork, and Appalachian craft traditions. He was based in Abingdon, about 30 miles east, and agreed to drive over the following Tuesday. When he arrived, He was a sturdy man with steel-rimmed glasses and calloused hands that suggested he had spent time at a forge himself. He carried a leather roll of examination tools and a digital camera. He spent over 4 hours with the contents of the iron box. He examined each piece under magnification, photographed the maker's marks from multiple angles, and tested the blade edges. He studied the pattern welding techniques under a handheld UV light. When the examination was finished, he sat across from Ren on an overturned bucket and laid out his findings piece by piece. The 7 pattern welded knives were exceptional examples of late 19th century American blacksmith work. The pattern on the blades indicated a level of skill that was rare even among professional smiths of that period. Based on the maker's mark, condition, and craftsmanship, he valued the knife collection at $12,000 to $16,000. The 3 ornamental iron pieces were museum-quality decorative forging, and the acorn finial alone, with its single-piece construction and botanical accuracy, was worth an estimated $4,500 to $7,000. The trivet and candle holder together were valued at $3,000 to $5,000. The 11 hand-forged tool heads with their matching maker's marks and specialized designs were worth $3,500 to $5,500 as a complete set. And the handwritten note, as a primary source document connecting the items to a specific maker, location, and date, added provenance value of $2,000 to $4,000 to the entire collection. The total appraised value fell between $35,000 and $53,500, and he told her the right auction could bring even more. He told her she could do well with the pieces, and that the right collector would pay a premium for that kind of provenance. This man hid his best work inside his own forge, he said, looking at the anvil with something close to reverence. He knew the fire would protect them from rust and moisture. He paused and looked at the note pinned beneath Ren's thumb, and he trusted that someday the right person would dig deep enough to find them. Ren asked him what kind of person hides his finest work instead of selling it. Webb thought about that for a moment. A man who believed the work mattered more than the money, he said. He handed Ren his card and the names of 2 auction houses that handled antique metalwork and Appalachian craft items. Ren did not sell everything from the iron box. She kept the acorn finial because it belonged in the building where it was made. She kept 2 of the 7 knives because they fit her hands, as though Hosea Garber had forged them for someone exactly her size. She kept all 11 tool heads because she intended to mount them on new hickory shafts and use them in the forge. And she kept the handwritten note, pinning it to the timber beam above the forge where it could watch over the room the way Hosea had intended. She consigned the remaining 5 knives, the trivet, the candle holder, and the original iron box to a regional auction house in Roanoke. The sale brought in $26,400 after the auction house deducted its commission. She kept the note, and the finial and the tools as her inheritance from a man she had never met. The renovation of the blacksmith shop began the week the auction payment cleared. Ren set a strict budget and tracked every dollar on the back of a receipt. She spent $145 on roofing supplies at the hardware store in Damascus, purchasing 2 bundles of metal roofing panels, sealant tape, and self-tapping screws. She patched the 2 leaking sections herself, climbing up on a borrowed ladder in the early morning before the metal got too hot to touch. She spent $110 on electrical materials and hired a licensed electrician from Abingdon who charged $320 for his labor. He ran a 30-amp service from the nearest utility pole and installed a breaker panel, 4 outlets, and 2 overhead shop lights. She spent $85 on plumbing supplies and paid a plumber $160 to connect a cold water line and install a utility sink in the back corner. She spent $40 on 6 bags of crushed limestone to patch and level low spots in the packed earth floor. She spent $55 on steel wool, wire brushes, linseed oil, and cleaning rags. She cleaned every iron tool by hand, scrubbing away rust and applying a thin coat of oil to prevent corrosion. She rehung the tongs and hammers on the original hand-forged wall hooks in their traditional arrangement. She cleaned the anvil face with a file and oiled the oak stump beneath it. She rebuilt the forge lining with 40 salvaged fire bricks she collected from a demolished chimney site 3 miles outside town. The fire bricks were free because the man who owned the demolition site told her to take as many as she could carry. She made 8 trips over 2 days hauling bricks in a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. The total renovation cost came to $1,115 when she added every receipt together. She had taken a building that had been abandoned for 26 years and restored it to working condition. The forge was functional, and the anvil was dressed and mounted. The tools hung clean and oiled on the walls. The roof no longer leaked and the lights turned on when she flipped the switch. Water ran from the tap in the back corner. The stone walls still wore their century of soot like a badge of honor. The packed earth floor still held the memory of 10,000 hammer blows. But the building was alive again. A man from the community stopped by during the second week of renovation. His name was Orville Dunford. He was 71 years old with thick white hair, heavy forearms, and hands scarred in the way that belongs only to people who have worked with hot metal. He stood in the doorway and looked at the forge for a long time without speaking. Then he walked to the anvil and placed his palm flat on its face. "I apprenticed here in 1969, he said quietly. Worked this same anvil for 2 years under the last smith." He paused and ran his thumb along the anvil's horn. His name was Godfrey Mace, and he could draw out a scroll with his eyes closed. Orville looked at Wren and asked if she was planning to light the forge. She nodded. He studied her for another moment and asked if she knew anything about smithing. "Not yet," she said, "but I intend to learn." He reached into his truck and pulled out a 50 lb bag of bituminous coal and set it on the floor beside the forge. He told her it would get her started, and that he would come back Saturday to show her how to manage a fire. He scratched Bramble behind her folded ear on his way out, and the dog leaned into his hand and closed her eyes. Orville came back every Saturday for 6 weeks straight. He taught Wren how to build and maintain a forge fire, and showed her how to read the color of heated steel to judge its temperature. Cherry red meant 400 degrees and bright orange meant 1,800. Yellow-white meant the steel was close to burning, and she needed to pull it fast. He taught her how to hold the tongs so the metal would not twist. He showed her how to strike the anvil with the flat of the hammer and let the rebound do half the work. He did not charge her a single dollar for any of it. When she asked why, he said, "Godfrey taught me for free and told me to pass it forward when the time came." On his last Saturday, he watched her forge a simple S-hook from a piece of round stock. She heated it, drew it out, scrolled both ends, and quenched it in the slack tub. The water hissed and sent a column of steam toward the ceiling. Orville picked up the finished hook and turned it in his scarred fingers. "That is clean work," he said. "Keep at it." She thanked him and asked if she could make him something for all his time. He shook his head. "You already did," he said. "You brought this forge back to life." Wren taught herself from there, starting with basic hooks, brackets, and fireplace tools. Her first 12 pieces were rough and uneven, and she knew it. She heated and reheated the same bar of steel until she understood how the metal moved under the hammer. She burned herself 4 times in the first month and learned to keep a jar of burned salve on the window sill. She discovered that the hand-forged tool heads from the iron box performed beautifully once she mounted them on new hickory handles. They worked better than any modern tool she had tried. The hammers had a balance that felt intentional, weighted to swing in a natural arc that her arm seemed to remember between sessions. The chisels cut cleaner with less effort. Hosea Garber had forged tools that were still superior a full century after he made them. She began to understand why he had hidden them inside the forge. They were not just tools. They were proof that a man's best work could outlast everything else he ever did. An elderly woman from the neighborhood visited the shop on a Thursday afternoon. Her name was Cleo Winslow, and she was 79 years old with white hair pinned in a loose bun and steady gray eyes behind thick glasses. She stood in the doorway and watched Wren work the forge for several minutes before speaking. "I remember the sound of this place," she said softly. "When I was a girl, you could hear that anvil ringing all the way down to the creek." She walked inside and studied the tools on the wall before touching the acorn finial on its shelf with one careful finger. She said that Hosea Garber had made it, and that her grandmother once called him the finest smith between Damascus and Knoxville. Wren set her tongs down and asked if Cleo had known him. Cleo shook her head and said he was gone long before her time, but his work had been everywhere in the town. She looked at Wren with her steady gray eyes and asked if she was the one who had dug his things out of the forge. Wren nodded. Cleo smiled. He would be glad it was someone who would use them. She left a jar of sourwood honey on the workbench and walked back out into the afternoon light. By the end of her 3rd month in Damascus, Wren had sold 22 hand-forged items at the Saturday farmers market and through the outfitter shop on consignment for a combined total of $485. She had a roof over her head for the first time in over a year. She had a trade that was teaching her hands something new every single day. She had running water and electric light, and a forge that burned hot and steady. She had a russet gold dog who carried sticks twice her size and pressed her nose against Wren's elbow every morning when the forge doors opened. And she had an iron box that had waited in the ashes of a cold forge for over 80 years, patient and still, for someone stubborn enough to dig down and find it. Zella Millsaps drove over from Bristol to see the building on a warm afternoon in late spring. She stood in the open doorway and watched Wren work at the anvil with the forge glowing orange and sparks flying each time the hammer struck. Bramble was lying on a folded wool blanket near the wall with her feathered tail draped over her nose, watching the sparks with her calm amber eyes. Zella walked inside slowly and looked around the room. She studied the clean tools on the walls, the acorn finial on a shelf above the forge, and the handwritten note pinned to the beam. Her eyes were bright when she turned back to Wren. She said her uncle would never have believed it. He had thought the place was finished. Wren set her hammer down and pulled off her leather gloves. It was just waiting, she said. Zella nodded slowly. I suppose some things are. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small black and white photograph showing the shop in 1955 with smoke rising from the chimney. She said quietly that she thought Wren should have it. Wren took the photograph and held it beside the one she still carried in her back pocket. The two pictures together spanned 32 years of the building's life, and now Wren was writing the next chapter with her own hands. That night, Wren sat alone at the anvil with the shop doors open to the warm spring air. The forge had burned down to a deep bed of orange coals that pulsed with slow heat. Rumble was curled on her blanket with her mismatched ears twitching in a dream. Laurel Creek murmured somewhere beyond the honeysuckle that climbed the stone walls. The acorn finial on the shelf caught the coal light and glowed like something alive. The note from Hosea Garber rustled once in the warm draft from the chimney. Wren picked up the cross-peen hammer with her right hand and a pair of tongs with her left. She pulled a length of round stock from the coal bed, and it came out glowing bright orange. She set it on the anvil face and struck. The ring of steel on steel echoed off the limestone walls and traveled out through the open doors into the Damascus night. It was the same sound that had rung from this building for 80 years, and now it was ringing again. Thank you for joining us here at Pond Trail Stories. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with someone who believes that hidden things are still worth finding. We will see you on the next trail.